Y'all see me? We live now. We live. Greetings, 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 and yeah, we live. Greetings and welcome back once again. This is Amuna Yisrael Solonomics 101, and today I have a special guest. Special guest. So definitely hold on. Let me make sure my thing is muted here. We're here to talk about some very interesting things. Today I have a special guest, Brother Baruti Katembo, and I hope I said your name correctly. Welcome to the discussion.
Hey, Mona, how are you? Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Tell a little bit about the audience, a little bit about you. I've been wanting to do more of. I used to do these type of roundtables or discussion interview type sessions. It takes a lot of coordinating, so sometimes I drop the ball. But we are here today, so we tell them a little bit about why you were interested in having this discussion about ADOS. And before that, feel free to let us know who you are. Just a little something. Just a little something.
Okay, and as you introduced me, my name is Baruti Katembo. I'm actually a co-author of a book entitled Uwanzi, The Pan-African Factor, 21st Century View. That was actually a co-authored book with two other authors, Kemet Shockley and David Akombo. And basically in that book, we were talking about, how can we get the African family together on all sides of oceans, diaspora, and the continent, and how we can all be resources for each other, and how the diaspora can be mutual resources for the African continent. And the other thing I want to say is that via the Dark Show program, which stands for Diaspora African, and that show is hosted by Ego Otubu. So I wanted to mention that because, and I'm glad I'm here on your show today, Imuna, because you were nice enough to participate in a fairly recent panel that the Dark Show had. So I'm glad that I can sort of come on your show, and perhaps this might be an extension of some of the ideas that were discussed on that panel. So thanks again for having me. And
thank you for having me. Definitely. Thank you for inviting me over, and thank you for having me. This every opportunity to research. If the information interests me, I love it. You know what I mean? And to discuss that research, it's also good. But so we're gonna get into today's topic. Before we do, can you let the people know, are your family from or were born or have generations that have been associated with the mainland of America?
Yes. So yes, my family generation in the United States, and like you call it, the mainland. So yes.
Okay, so textbook, just for textbook, this is another ADOS conversation. So for textbook, for those people who are kind of strict when they come to the channel, well, is he ADOS? Because some people only want to see that, and then if they don't see that, then they're not trying to hear you. So the answer is yes before we get started. So
the answer is yes, as in no, I don't define. No, wait, I don't define myself as ADOS.
No, I'm not saying you are ADOS. I'm saying for the textbook definition, right, of having the connection to what many people are saying qualifies someone as ADOS. I'm not saying that you are self-identifying as ADOS.
Yes.
Okay. So so today's discussion is Trailblazers or Crumb Snatchers. Right? We're going to talk about African American immigrants from an ADOS perspective. What are your thoughts? You brought up this topic. I thought it would be interesting. In the beginning, what are your thoughts about this overall? Before we take a deep dive. Overall, do you think that those who come from continent or the Caribbean or South America who are also melanated, do you think they're coming to crumb snatch?
No, I think that's a term that's being used in some talking points around the so-called ADOS movement. No, I think that people are coming to the United States for varying reasons, most particularly some, you know, fearing violence and marginalization in other countries, and also to make a new life for themselves and a new start here to find opportunities. I don't think it's, you know, particularly to come and to look at what's called the African American community and take from the African American community in that sense. But I think those sometimes are talking points. Conversation and in various kind of discussions.
So what? And I know we spoke about a little earlier some of the statistics that could possibly paint this narrative. I guess we can start there of why someone who, shalom and peace to all those who just joined us. Why someone would, and someone's asking what is ADOS? It's a term that is now being, I guess, propagated. American descendants of slaves, and it comes with a whole lot of stuff attached. But what are some of your thoughts as to why someone would possibly perceive those who are coming here to become snatchers, such as educational wise, employment wise? What are some of your findings?
Well, I don't know. I would say that the perception is that the African American community is not made as in all areas of socioeconomic indicators of success in the way that it should be, in terms of lagging in academic performance in public schools, admissions to college, and having certain levels of average income. And so therefore, the perception is that African and Caribbean immigrants who are coming to the United States are doing better statistically than the so-called native blacks, if we can say it that way. And therefore, because of the comparison, that somehow the bulk of the black population in the United States, which some have defined as ADOS, are lagging behind because of, in part, the aggressive behavior of African and Caribbean immigrants, favoritism toward these groups by white people against the native black population, and that the native black population is sort of falling behind, and that whatever benefits or rights or civil rights that black people from generations in the past have fought for have not been actualized in terms of full fruition, while newcomer African Caribbean immigrants have overshadowed the so-called rightful place of gains of the native black population. And so therefore, in some of the hashtag ADOS rhetoric, then the groups that are immigrant blacks are already thought of as avatars, as in people who are coming who look like the so-called native black population, but who are gaining ground because they can pretend or take the place of, like a covering of African American people, but are supposedly not African American people, but are gaining the benefits and are masking themselves to gain benefits, while the so-called true native black people, you know, lag behind. And this also fits into ideas about the white population favoring immigrant black people over native black people, which is in some degree true, but I don't think that fully explains the talking points about the failure of the so-called native Black population to achieve as high of levels as should be. By the way, there are a lot of very successful so-called native Black people in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The percentage, if you have, it's really estimated to be about 50 to 60 million, let's just say Black diaspora people, African diaspora in the United States. And out of that, if we go on the low end, let's say 50 million, it's about 10% of the 50 million that would be first or second generation African or Caribbean immigrant. So therefore, the bulk of the population is so-called native Black people. So in that regard, there are millions of African American people who have generations of ancestry on the United States soil that are, they're doing, okay and are successful. Now, do we have too high of proportions of those who are not? Yes, but I don't think the failure to minimize the proportion of the group that's not doing very well in terms of socioeconomic indicators on the presence of immigrating Black people. No, I don't believe that, and I don't think that overall the immigrating Black people are pretty much taking massive opportunities away from so-called African Americans who have long-term soil existence in the United States. But okay. I think those are talking points that people will bring up to create, kind of a xenophobic, discussion. Also, hopefully we can get into why is the targeting on African and Caribbean immigrants versus just immigrants in the, coming to the United States. Hispanic immigrants, Asian immigrants, various kind of Caucasian immigrants. Why is the dissension, always seemingly between different types of Black people? Perhaps we'll get into that discussion. I have some thoughts on that. Mention of what I said.
So just to recap, from what I heard you saying, that one, there is perceivably some favoritism towards African and Caribbean immigrants in relationship for the system, in relation to them. There's perceivably some, and you said that in your estimation, there's some truth to that. And then there is a level of contention with the thought that melanated peoples who immigrate here are, because they look like and can pass for, because it's like passing, right? Can pass for a home, what you used to say, a native, right? Which is even these terms. Some people be like, I'm gonna be tripping up because I'll be tripping up on some of these terms. But can pass for, then there's an indifference because someone is passing for you, but is not you and has not put in the sweat equity that those who are passing are actually accessing. That's what I'm hearing?
You broke up a little bit in the last part of the sentence that you gave.
I'm trying to get it. I'm looking at the possible cause of the contention and the perception, which is that the person who was here, who have a descendants of those coming from slavery, Jim Crow, that someone who's newly coming, like for instance, I'm gonna give an analogy. Your cousin, right? Your cousin comes, and your cousin is not you, and you've been at home all this time, and your cousin comes just in time to get the same benefits you get. Is that fair to say? And that creates like this indifference and resentment, like you wasn't even here, and now here you come getting access to the things that I work for.
Well, yes, but when you say things that you work for, the talking points are that you're not benefiting or getting the things that you work for, and the others are coming.
Oh, you're breaking up.
Like if it's kind of like if I'm working to get $10, it's not like the talking points are I'm getting $10, but you're coming also and you're getting $10. Mm-hmm. It's like I'm supposed to get $10, but I'm not getting my $10, and you're getting the $10 in lieu of me.
Oh, lieu, and that's the word I was going for. So now the question is there truth to that? You're breaking up a little bit. I don't know what's wrong with the connection all of a sudden today. Can you hear me, Bruty?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
So, but is there truth to that? Because that wouldn't that therein lie the issue? It's all about perspective. Is it only this one allocation and it's whoever gets there first, or do people from other places have other are programmed different culturally that makes them or incentivize them towards what is available? Because that's some of what I know. You sent me over some videos of to watch, and I also watched some other videos. And what one of the things that came up is the way in which or African or mainland continent peoples and those coming from the Caribbean, many times the way in which they're programmed towards this thought of education, which is one of the places of contention, right? So and I'll give you back over the mic, but this is one of the things that would benefit in having a discussion to say, is someone coming to slight you, or is someone coming and saying, hey, this is an opportunity, I'm going for it, you should too?
It's probably the latter. It's probably the latter. Mm-hmm. It's hard for me to, I mean, you said a lot, and I know what you're saying. And I know the titling of the show.
we gotta stay in this lane, Brother Bruce.
And what I'm saying is,
don't jump off the lane now.
No, I'm trying to do that. To try to get where you are, where you're talking about, and I'm gonna do the best I can to stay in the lane of the titling of the show. Yeah, will you let me kind of answer it the way I want to deal with it? Let me try to answer it because you're asking questions that I can say yes or no, but I always feel like I want to put some bit of context around.
All right, let's get some. But then, like we tried this the other day, just to let the people know. We tried to get context on this conversation the other day. Had the whole conversation in the green room, right? That's why I'm laughing, because that's where you're gonna end up. You know, we like context, and then we end up all the way at the beginning of this whole discussion. But all right. I'm gonna give you some time to answer it in the way in which you see fit, and I'm gonna be here, and then I'm gonna play a little bit of a perspective from a video that you sent to me, and the name of the video is "Why My Nigerian Parents Don't Like Black People." Y'all know I don't like that term, so I do this.
Right.
And so I'm gonna play a little bit about that. So just to remind you, we have something. So go ahead, brother. I'll give you the mic.
Okay, thanks. And then you know, trying to engage me in between, and that might bring out some other ideas as we try to stay right on focus. Okay, well, first of all, see, like in your delivery just a second ago, you kind of asked the question, is it a matter of there are some cultural differences, say, toward education that is different between, let's just say, new Africans. And when I say new Africans, I'm just saying people from the African continent and Caribbean. If you want me to say Caribbean and African, fine, but I'm just saying new Africans. Is that okay?
It's gonna confuse everybody, but go ahead.
Okay, all right.
It's probably gonna confuse the
people coming from African countries, and new people immigrating to the United States from Caribbean countries. Okay, I'll keep them separate. Okay. Now, first of all, education for mainlander Black people or African Americans, you know, these terms have actually always been a major focus until recently. See, today the image is that the so-called native Black people or African American people don't value education as a major pursuit. That has not been true at all, and has not been true in stereotype either. It's only seemingly true with the, say, over the last 40 years, about what I would say is the slippage in focus on high culture. This is important because, you know, we in the United States, there had been a big focus as we're moving toward, you know, let's say the 1960s, you know, civil rights protests. The whole thing was about, you know, can we continue to achieve? We had the Black Power movement, which did emphasize a type of Afrocentricity, but we sort of left that. In part, it could have been a de-emphasis on that because of so-called integration or notions about integration into corporate America. Other things began to happen in the mid-'80s in which, you know, there were pockets of communities in the United States that did not feel that they were getting their fair share. They were complaining about, you know, poverty, lack of some opportunities. And then the expression of this got articulated in terms of rap. But see, white capital began to put monies behind the notions, so-called voices of the ghetto. And then that gave greater voice to certain kinds of negatives regarding speech, dress, the whole idea about, did you need to be really cultured? See, you know, when you start giving rise to that kind of rhetoric, then a lot of people begin to say, hey, you know, we aren't getting anywhere, so it's no need to promote the notion about high culture. I do what I want to do. You know, I don't need to respect others. I don't need to respect authority. That's not going to get me anywhere. So let's have a different kind of speech, you know, rebellion, not really respecting authority. Everything about the material or the paper. This became part of the rhetoric that was part of the industry of rap that kept getting promoted. This became part of the cultural structure that became the stereotype broad brushed across the whole people. Well, at this time, one of the slippages was to allow this to continue when we had been promoting a level of high culture, jazz, even Afrocentricity, you know, the idea about being mannerly toward adults, authority, etc. And then certain elements of a culture took a nosedive, and that became widespread. Okay, well, at the same time in the mid-'80s, this is when you began to get more of influxes of African peoples from different African nations and people from the Caribbean coming into the United States. In the mid-'80s, there were only about 800,000 so-called immigrant Black people. Today, it hovers around 5 million. So at the time in which the African-American march of aspirant culture was high and then began to take a parallel downward, this is at the time in which there was expanding populations of immigrating Black people. So at the time that they began to meet the African-American person, the perceptions were more negative, therefore causing a kind of a shunning of the so-called African-American person in a broad brush that, you know, African-American people were basically uncouth. You know, the culture, was not positive, or the views, values, and habits did not lend itself toward positive growth. So here you have these newly immigrating African diaspora people, African nations, and people from the Caribbean who are looking at the United States as a fresh start. I'm here. I'm encouraging education. I'm saving every penny. I'm doing this and that. And then you have perception about this native Black group that's already been here that have sort of been worn out, or sort of are drifting away, upward trend to the downward trend, and a people that you don't want to be involved with. You don't want to marry them. You don't want to be associated with them. And the United States is happy to plug into these divisions. After all, the so-called African American population has been an irritation to the white population, complaining for rights, challenging white people about the system, complaining about racism, and therefore the immigrant Black population can be used on various occasions to show that the African American population has no valid claims that there's rampant racism, particularly when you can hold up a poster and say, look at the Jamaican immigrant. See how much they're working. See how they're achieving. Look at the Nigerian immigrant. They're working. Are they not Black like you? And so, therefore, there is some favoritism because of the immigrant Black communities appearing to be the model type Black people. But I think that African American people or native Black people could be doing better if we change our views, values, and habits overall, so that we could be doing much better, so that the interaction could be more positive between the native Black people and the immigrating Black people who are coming. Perhaps in this show, or in another show, we can deal with what may have gone wrong beyond what I've already said, and maybe some correctives. But let me just kind of stop there and see if you had any what I'm saying.
As you were speaking, I'm like, okay, the picture is coming into view, right? And I can't help but use my slavery analogy. So from what, I'm just going to sum it up and let me know if I'm wrong. From what I got is the perception is, and the word I was thinking as you were talking about is this fatigue, that after all this time of trying these different avenues, and you're absolutely right, there are many records coming out of the institution of slavery that education is the way to get ahead. And one of the elders, I remember reading a narrative, she was complaining, this was in the 1930s, that the younger children were so headstrong and desiring education that they forgot practical skills, right? And so there was even this conversation at that time between intellect and the practicality of everyday lives that one would have had in slavery, of knowing how to do things. But I wanted to say,
well, that's another story too. You see, like in the United States today, we still have about 105 historically Black colleges and universities.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to the beginning of the 20th century, just prior to the beginning of the 20th century, there were probably a little over 120
a lot of them closed.
HBCUs or historically Black colleges, to just to explain the acronym. Now, why I'm mentioning this is because basically the Black colleges had been sort of separated into two tracks. One was the liberal arts track, which was skills that were non-agrarian or generally manual dexterity type situation of using your hands. and the other colleges were basically agricultural, technical, mechanical. The split in these kinds of college focuses, as it was separated in white communities too, paralleled the thoughts of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. In my personal view, I think that Booker T. Washington's ideas about, concentrating on, physical skills and learning the science behind those things and economics were the way to go. But W.E.B. Du Bois articulated that, the quest should have been immediately for civil rights. But more people, or at least the ear of the general leadership, kind of went with W.E.B. Du Bois's idea, so that the notion about the idea about building industrially, was agricultural development, mechanical development, and the idea about, building an economic base as opposed to a civil rights base for empowerment, I think was missed, that we didn't go in that direction. I know that's another subject, but all these things kind of tie in.
They do.
But during the segregation or Jim Crow era, Black people were forced to have their own businesses and have their own societies that were seemingly in parallel to having a smaller infrastructure that paralleled the white infrastructure. But I think there were some mistakes made along the way about what would be the direction of empowerment. And it wasn't just like we abandoned our, skills, because all along the way, there have been plenty of, inventions, but those kinds of skills and other sorts of things that have been contributions of African people to the United States. Everything from, the traffic light, done by Garrett Morgan to that toy. Have you ever seen a toy in store called the Super Soaker water gun?
Yeah, the Super Soaker.
That was done by Lonnie Johnson, who was a propulsion engineer.
There's actually a children's book as well. So for those out there want to know what their children, there's a children's book that was written on that. My children read that book. It was pretty cool. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right. So we have had and still do have lots and lots of people with all kinds of skills.
But Brother Brutti, I'm gonna have to push back on you a little bit. Can I push back a little bit? I'm trying to find one of the quotes so that I don't misquote what she was saying, but I'll push back a little bit. Comparatively, the survival skills, although it was under duress, right? The survival skills that the mass majority of the population had as compared to today, for instance, knowing how to, even though the labor in planting was being taken, one knew how to bust a seed, bring it up, eat out your garden. You see what I'm saying? I'm talking about survival skills, how to dig grounds and how to, like, if anything goes down, you knew how to survive. I was reading, and just shortly, I was, and I wanted to share it. There was a documentary I didn't know came out. I just saw it.
Well,
that was made with
this story. Well, okay.
No, that's what I was making reference to. I was making reference to these hard skills of how to make furniture, how to make your bed, how, you know what I'm saying? These real-time skills that many times right now, the majority of people only know how to be on the computer. And if you put them into a natural element, something that you can materialize and actually get an economy going, we'll be sitting around looking like, where's the internet? Where's the Wi-Fi? What do I do? You know what I mean? So that's what I was talking about. Go ahead.
Oh, well, okay. Let me just throw out an idea, and I hope I'm kind of hitting on what you're saying. Okay, listen, at all levels of the United States' development, colonially and post-colonially, obviously the African population has been here. So whatever the United States is now in terms of, you know, the level of industrialization, you know, Black people have paralleled that. So if you say, well, in the United States, most people don't live on farms anymore. Everything is more or less, you know, done by large scale farms, commercial farms to feed people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's true. So if you say, well, you know, African people may not generally have all of those, as you say, survival skills. That's true, but that's not the primary reason that we're behind.
But isn't it attached to land though? If we're talking about what the reasons of which, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, if we're talking about the reasons of which, one of the key reasons, one of the key contentions, one of the original reparations, because we're having this ADOS conversation, is land and the ability to govern this land and farm this land and benefit from this land, then the association with land and the ability to have those skills are part of this discussion, right? Because if people were to gain access to it, what you're going to do with it? You see what I'm saying? If we're talking about in the context, and we're going to come to, because I see some people talking about reparations. But before we talk about that, we're just talking about the perception of your brothers and sisters who are coming from other spaces and why this perception may be what it is.
Yeah, but I'm saying okay. Most people who are coming to this country who are immigrants are not coming to set up farms. I mean, they're not setting up farms. So no, it's not like. No, I'm trying to say to you, the U.S. is a first world country in which most people go to the grocery store to get food. Now, should we have more survival skills? Yes. But what I'm saying is, it's not like the African American people who are here just lack survival skills, and therefore that's the reason why we're behind. And immigrant Black people are coming and are having those survival skills that the African American person does not have. They're coming and they are blending into what is available already in the society. The reason I want to try to make sure I'm hitting what you're saying, what you're bringing.
No, I brought up the farming thing because I was contrasting it to what some of the narratives that I read about being drawn away from thinking that it's not with the hard skills and being pulled. I was addressing what you were talking about the eventual fatigue and the change of the value system or what was being projected to society. That's kind of why I brought up farms, because when it transitioned from hard survival skills to intellectual education, to civil rights, to all of these things, it got further and further away from real skills until you got to the part where the person who didn't have the education, the person who was still in the ghetto, they got their voice because they were always there. You see what I'm saying? And so now, according to what I'm hearing you say, when they get their voice, the projection.
The rap stuff like that started.
Mm-hmm. But wait, let's finish this part. I'm gonna give it over. I'm gonna give it over to you.
I wanted to start at a different place.
I'm gonna give it to you. Wait, hold on, brother. I'm gonna give it to you. Rap culture is the voice of the oppressed. Those who never got to those spaces, those who were still in the ghetto, those families who moved from the South and came to the North and were still in the ghettos and were still in the places and still not achieving this American dream. And the only way that they were able to get any recognition is by sharing their suffering. Right? That's that element of society has always been here. They may not have always been heard from.
Right, but white capital put monies behind them to allow the voice of the ghetto, as you say, to proliferate in ways that it would not have done before. But this time, we're talking about changes in views and values in terms of expression that were used to broad brush the whole group. So when we start talking about this idea of, it doesn't matter, how you speak. It doesn't matter you know, kind of what you believe in. You don't have to be a cultured person. You know, these kinds of ideas began to, you know, germinate. And then the perception of this kind of culture that became thought of in some ways as the thug culture. This has been painted across the African American community, along with, you know, higher levels of crime and other sorts of things that have disproportionately affected our community, that broad brushes us. And I'm saying that we have not concentrated on a narrative that, you know, is uplifting. We have allowed a negative narrative to be shared and seen by newcoming African peoples, newcoming Black peoples, and we have not told a narrative that was more positive or allowed a narrative to germinate. What I'm saying is, you got 90%, if you got the majority of Black people in the United States, 90% are so-called native Black people, then the narrative that we wish to share for inclusion of newcoming Black people who are coming to this space, we should have had an incubator to make sure that that narrative gets told.
Okay, I'm putting my hand up like I'm in school. How can I say something? Okay, I think I spoke about this before, right? Even though the narrative, there was a effort in certain spaces early on to speak in a certain way and present in a certain way and kind of, you know, have these two sides. Would it be fair to say that the participation of the stereotypical image of the melanated person in America was also contributed by those who are melanated in America, i.e. the entertainment industry? And this is before rap. This is early on when when many decided to put on the blackface and represent these stereotypical characters to the world. And later on, even if you want to jump from there to the 70s, and you have blaxploitation films where people were willing to, for a check, represent this other side of the culture to the world. This is where a lot of the world got, okay, this is what goes on. And we can see that common thread. Yes, somebody else may be like, I'm going to give you the studio time, you know, I'm going to write the script, but you have people of the culture who are willing to do this. Like, and some people just say, oh, it's art, it's entertainment. How much of it is really just entertainment? And should the entertainers be held accountable?
Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, they should. I think that the real, very, very negative images came about with the explosion of the, you know, gangster rap and negative imagery around that.
I've watched some of those. I've watched.
I'm sorry, that's just the way it is.
No,
because I'm kind of old enough on the tail end of when the culture just downslid, taking a total nosedive completely. I would agree. That's the way
I would agree that it totally went left. But before that point, the grandparents and the great grandparents were willing to, like, if you watch some of these blackface films where they're willing to stand there and let the European character say you're dumb and say you're stupid and say you're shiftless and say you're not worth anything. Like, some of these stuff you can still, this is what's putting in the mind. This is what I'm talking about. That was setting the groundwork.
Major. I don't think that was the thing that made, you know, the African American person look bad to the world, because that was projected about African people globally. Oh, I mean, no. I'm talking about as a distinct uncouth group. I mean,
okay, what about the blaxploitation films during the 70s? you would remember more than me because I'm. What about those films that hypersexualize the melanated people that began to reinforce these stereotypes of the welfare mother? And I forgot the name of the film; it escapes me now. But all of these, you know what I'm talking about? That showed these. I mean, Good Times is showing ghetto life before ghetto got on the rap record.
Right.
Good Times is showing this, and then they came and put a soundtrack to it.
Okay, well, some of those were negative, but then again, interestingly, you should mention that because one of the movies that was made in the 1970s, which unfortunately I have not seen it all, but I saw a little bit of excerpts via YouTube and then read some more information about it. It was a movie that was actually heavily financed by the Delta Sigma Theta sorority called Countdown to Kusini. And it was designed to be a movie that would portray African people, Black women in particular, in a royal African sort of way. And the movie was shot in Lagos, Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
And it starred Greg Morris. If people look up Greg Morris's name, Greg Morris starred in a TV series in the United States called Mission Impossible. It was one of the first kind of series that showed a Black person in a serious sort of way. So it was actually shot in Lagos, Nigeria, and starred him along with other characters. And this movie is actually, in some ways, given credit as a launch point and a catalyst for Nollywood, actually. So I would say that the points that you make about some of the negative imagery of the Blaxploitation is true, but there were a lot more positive images that we were trying to portray that counterbalance that.
I would say the children. I would say thank you for that. But once we know that negative takes a stronghold. If you don't, it takes way more positive images. Hold on, I'm sorry.
Yes, but what I'm saying to you, Imuna, what I'm trying to say to you is that yes, some of the images in the Blaxploitation were negative, but then again, there were very few immigrating Black people in the United States. Now, if your point is that people are still seeing these Blaxploitation films across the world, okay. But what I'm saying is that I think that overall, as a society, the African American people just overall were a sort of a better people than is projected now. See, the African immigrant groups and Caribbean immigrants who are coming to the United States now, they are interacting with some areas of the African American community in terms of their being physically here. So the negativity is not only what they perceive, but negative statistics and also negative interactions that they perceive. So even if you have the Blaxploitation films, late 1960s, early 19 to mid 1970s, those were films that did not necessarily display the whole group. You see what I'm saying? In other words, I'm just the issues you're bringing up may have some truth, but that's not the major reason why the rift happens.
No, I
want to go back to the real rift, that the reason and how the rift actually occurred.
I'm actually going off of, and sorry about that, that was the babies, but I'm actually going off of your premise about the rift and about the imagery that others are seeing. So I'm just kind of on that road, and I'm talking about the
The
participation.
imagery is now. The imagery is now.
No, but this is what I'm saying. This royalty, 70s, 60s lays the foundation for anything that we're experiencing. And it is known that negative images stick with you more than positive images do. You need a flood of positive images to overtake one negative image, right? And so if you had participation, what I'm talking about is, because we're talking about perceptions and we're talking about how people are seeing other people groups, and I'm exploring the possibility of taking a level of responsibility for this image, at least in the participation of this image. And I took it as far back as the minstrel shows, right? And the participation there, and how you had some people within the culture who were able, for instance, in doing my research for the book I wrote, Angry Black Woman Syndrome Revisited, I came across some information. You remember Aunt Esther?
Yeah.
This is okay. Aunt Esther, I forgot her real name. I'm gonna look it up right now.
Sanford and Son.
Yeah, from Sanford and Son. Aunt Esther got pushback in the 70s for portraying that character. I want to go get her name. So as I was reading, there were people who were really upset. Like, why are you, like you're saying, there was a shift where you had entertainers and musicians, mostly entertainers, actors, and then later on became the musicians, who were willing to present this image. And they had people like, why are you doing this? Why are you showing that to the world? But then you got to a point where the actors is like, I don't care. It's a paycheck. I'm going to go do me. Yeah. But you did have a level of accountability in the community. But once that faded, the door was open, and it was, you know, and I'm going to go find her name right now because I'm that type of person. Let me go find her.
Aunt Esther, even though there were drawbacks to her character, Aunt Esther did not.
LaWanda Page. LaWanda Page. Her name is LaWanda Page.
LaWanda Page did not portray any moral, uncouth person, regardless of the character.
She
did not.
She was the stereotypical angry black woman, though. That I've studied her because of the stereotype of the angry black woman. And so she was the stereotypical, because we're also looking at why the thought is that master or the European in control favors those, and I actually heard someone say this, favors other people groups, is because according to what I'm hearing, the expectation of the attitude, the resentment, or the indifference that's going to come from those who have longer been amongst them. Is that something fair to say? That it's not just, oh, that you're coming from another country, but it's the way in which, like you said it earlier in this conversation, that to the Europeans here, mainland melanated people have long been this kind of what's the word you said? I don't even want to misquote you, but have long presented a bit of a problem, or as one of the books says, a Negro dilemma, right? And which I still need to read that book. That book is very interesting. But yeah. Can that be the perception of, listen, you're going to come and you're going to work and you're not going to give me any pushback because you don't have that issue with me? Yeah. And so that particular barrier.
That's a narrative that is pushed, that immigrating black people won't give the white people in the country much of a problem because they, immigrating black people, supposedly don't have a beef with the white people in the United States. It's only the native black people who have been. Yes, that's primarily the narrative. Yes.
I'm sorry about that. See, I had to bring one of the babies up in here because she out there cutting up. So if you see me go off camera, you know what time it is. Okay, so we're getting somewhere. For those who just joined us, we're having the discussion. We have Brother Baruti here with us. I'm enjoying the discussion. I see y'all getting it popping in the comment section. I would say as long as we keep it clean and respectful, then, you know, keep doing what you do. But I think we're getting something here concerning the participation, the perception, and some truths that we have to admit that, yes, coming from another country, you're in, and again, I have to go to my domestic abuse scenario. My domestic abuse scenario is that melanated people coming from other places have their baggage, but this is not their place of abuse. And given that this is not their place of abuse, they're able to interact differently because it's like you went to your cousin's house and you know your cousin is getting abused, but you're not. To a certain degree, I can't even all the way say you're not, but your perception of their abuse is different. You process it different. What else do you have to say here, Brother Babuti? Let me see how we're doing on time. I think we're doing good on time.
Well,
should I play the video now?
That's fine. We can sort of vibe off of the video a little bit.
Okay. Okay.
And then after that, I guess we'll kind of get to perhaps the so-called anti-black immigrant xenophobia of some of the ADOS rhetoric. After that, as a kind of an extension of some of the negative interactions and negative perceptions existing within the let's just say the African diaspora communities in the United States, because I think we have to talk about why the ADOS movement seems to be generating, in part, angry rhetoric toward or between African and Caribbean immigrants versus so-called native Africans.
Right.
When the supposed overall thrust of ADOS is for reparations for slavery and Jim Crow and economic marginalization. So all the infighting is and negative fallout is not over whether reparations should be given, but it's some other things that get tangled in it that creates the internal community discussions. And I think that's interesting that we've got to explore, because the quest for reparations is not new.
Right.
And if we want to look at some scholars in the United States who talked about reparations, say even back in the mid-'80s, not that reparations had not been even dealt with prior to that, but in terms of just a fairly modern retrospect look at that, there was no anti-black immigrant sentiment in the mid-1980s when lots of scholars were dealing with the notion about reparations. And we need to discuss why there was no anti-black immigrant sentiment, but why it is today. What was different about then and now?
Can we talk about? I don't want to go too long. All right, I think we should touch that. I don't want to go too long, but yeah, and I think I'll just bring up some points about the need for the revisionist form of history in order to do what you're talking about, what is being done, which is creating this new I don't know, maybe it was there. Maybe it was there, but we didn't know. Because in order for someone to hit a vein like this, and maybe it's always been a level of an undercurrent, and now this is permission to express it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, it wasn't many African immigrants or African and Caribbean immigrants in the United States at the time, and the sentiment at that time was more on Pan-African development. See, the ADOS movement wants to take out the term we've talked about before, take out African from African American and just make it American. See, this is different, because in the 1980s, the term African American gained there's always been plenty of people in the United States who have actually been from different kinds of backgrounds.
You're correct.
From other countries. Okay, let me ask you, have you ever seen one of the old James Bond movies called called Live and Let Die?
No.
You never seen that one? Okay. You ever heard of an actor by the name of Yaphet Kotto?
I think I have. My father likes watching those old movies.
Okay. Have you seen the original Alien movie, 1979?
Is it scary? I don't like scary movies.
No, it has a monster in it. Yes.
Yeah, it's scary. I never liked scary movies.
Yeah, I mean, Yaphet Kotto was originally from Cameroon.
Okay.
Okay. Now, what about Sidney Poitier?
Yep.
Sidney Poitier's background is from the Bahamas.
Correct.
See, so this is not. Yeah, this has not been.
Even I'm sorry. Even oh, her name just escaped me. She was in Roots. She was Kunta Kinte's mother in Roots. Tell me her name. And she's like almost 90 now. Oh, you know who I'm talking about. Audience members, you know who I'm talking about. It's gonna come to me right now. Before you go on, hold on.
You're not talking about Cicely Tyson.
Cicely Tyson. Cicely Tyson is Caribbean. Yeah, has Caribbean heritage. That's her name.
Okay.
And
yeah. So that was never a problem.
Yeah.
Whole lot of people.
There's a whole lot of people. There's a whole lot of people. So we're gonna press play. And then when you bring up the people, because it's being pushed that there aren't a whole lot of people, and then they say, oh, that's nominal. I'm like, well, which one is it? Is it gonna be some people or there's never gonna be any people? I don't know. Like you said, we gotta get to what's behind all of this discussion. But let's hear someone that the name of the video is Why My Nigerian Parents Don't Like Quote Unquote Black People. So I'm gonna press play.
Superiority complex towards Black people. They just don't like them. And I mean, a lot of people don't like Black people for some reason. But I wanted to know why exactly my parents, why my Nigerian parents don't like Black people. I mean, aren't we all Black? No, Ada, you are not Black. You are not Akata. We are Nigerians. We know where we come from. We are not waywards. Black people are so disrespectful.
Okay, she said a lot in that beginning there. Hold on. But to begin with, she made the assertion that a lot of people don't like Black people. That, like, I break down what people say, just for the way I study. What are your thoughts on that assertion being that a lot of people don't like Black people, but I just want to know why Nigerians don't like Black people? And then she goes on to use this word Akata. Have you heard this word Akata? I'll share my first time hearing it. I think my first time hearing it is when a lot of people heard it, which is from New Jack City. But have you heard it? Has anybody called you something of this nature, or have you heard about it?
No, I haven't been called that directly to me. I mean, I have fairly recently heard the term being used, and what it means is basically a kind of a slur toward the Black person whose ancestry is in the United States for a long time, to kind of brush with the idea that we're talking about an uncultured person or an uncouth person that is in need of refinement.
So I find that, well, hold on. I find it interesting. I think I read it here before out of this book, actually. I read it out of this book, African Voices of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. And the reason I read it is because it shares that how people from the continent view others, even in their own spaces, who may have been a slave, right? And they view it negatively. So is this something that's their general worldview? Or is it something that it's specific for quote unquote African Americans? Do you understand what I'm saying? Because some of this might just be who the person is, or some of it might be by a direct attack.
All right. Well, let me ask you a question. Okay. Now, we talked before, you mentioned that you are from a Jamaican background, though you're born in the United States, but your parents are from Jamaica, right? Now, I want you to just follow me on this, just kind of maybe answer yes or no, then I can move along in this kind of dialogue. Okay, how many people from the African continent in general are, or from Nigeria, if you want to be specific, if we look at Akata as being a kind of a West African term, let's just put the big groups, you know, people from Ghana and Nigeria who always kind of get tagged with the usage of this term, okay? Mm-hmm. How many people from Nigeria or Ghana, for example, are moving to Jamaica?
I think it's the reverse. I don't think, I wouldn't, off the top of my head, I don't know, but I do know that there are a lot of people from Jamaica moving to Ghana, namely, and Nigeria.
Right. And for varying reasons. But in other words, you don't have basically people moving from the African continent basically to Jamaica or other Caribbean spaces, but they're moving to the United States for the notion that the United States, as a so-called first world industrialized country, will provide economic opportunities and a new life for varying immigrating peoples, inclusive of people from the continent. So therefore, the interaction between the so-called African-American population is going to be met with new coming people into the United States. So that's why, so even if you could make the point that, well, you know, a lot of people on the continent may look at people, African people who have been formerly descendants of people who have been enslaved negatively, even if that's so, or even if you could show that was so, the reason that the term would come up even on the basis of that is because the interaction opportunity is happening with people from the continent moving to the United States. Correct. So that's where the interaction is going to happen, and the observance of, you know, the so-called African-American people in the space of the United States. Now, according to what you are saying, what you might be trying to theorize is that, well, if people from Nigeria or Ghana, as an example, were moving to Jamaica, maybe they call people in Jamaica, black people in Jamaica, Akata.
This is the question, because this is the question, but then this is the question, but then we would have to get a what is Akata? Because I've heard many
like an uncouth, you know, like you know, kind of like you're unrefined and uncouth type of person. That's the way it seems to be, you know, directed. So now in the United States, why do these slangs come up? Because it's projected that first of all, that the African-American person doesn't really have any culture, and that whatever one says is their semblance of culture is negative or tainted or debased, and that this is a term to denote that. So that if somebody calls somebody Akata, well, that's just an African way, I guess, of just saying you're just a nigger.
Right.
You know,
you're a ninja. They're calling her you're a ninja, basically. They're basically. Okay, so I'm a press play. That was very interesting. I hope y'all taking your notes. This is a good discussion. We're gonna play a little bit more.
But the elders, what is this Black Lives Matter nonsense? Every single life matters. Somebody was killing one another. Black lives matter, but you are killing yourself. Look at these black teenagers having babies.
Okay, wait. She just said another issue that she hears come up in her household is that her mother is saying or asking the question, what is Black Lives Matter? Again, that has to do with whether or not those who are coming here are familiar with the struggle of those who are here. And so she's saying another point that the mother is making is that if Black Lives Matter, then why are other melanated people killing other melanated people? So when they come here and they turn on the television or look in the newspaper or see what's going on, this is something that's right before your face, and it's undeniable. Even as recent as 2 days ago, one would have to say, and I don't know why, and I've been very quiet just looking at it. I don't listen to rap music. But this particular passing of one half, as some would say, ADOS, half Eritrean or Ethiopian, one would have to ask the question, Nipsey Hussle, I believe they call him in California, this is an observance of this is just 2 days ago, and this is rather notable, right? And so she's saying that the parent is looking at this discussion and saying, well, the question is, why don't you like Black people? And then the question is, well, do so-called American Black people like American Black people? You understand what I'm saying?
Right,
and this particular thing that happened recently, it really hit me, and I'm trying to figure out why is it hitting me the way it is, just looking at where someone is, the culture, because he kept talking about rap culture and this culture. There is a culture, but we have to look at a culture of what? You know what I mean? And trying to go against that and repairing kind of this reparations in your particular neighborhood, and then the very questions of do Black lives, so-called Black Lives Matter, have to come to the forefront because it's another melanated person who took another melanated person's life. So how can we deny looking at these then to ask the question, you know, what's really going on here?
Because
and I just have to put that in because, you know, I know that there's many condolences to the family and the friends who may be grieving at this time. But go ahead.
Every time you look on the 6 o'clock news across the country, and local 6 o'clock newses across the country, you know, African American people are disproportionately featured as being connected to some type of criminal behavior, an incarceration, an arrest, murder, you know, petty thievery, carjacking, all these kinds of things, which help shape and cement a narrative of negativity among people who are looking at the news, upon, you know, people who are outside the United States, who have a perception about the African American population, and a narrative that, you know, of course, white people in the United States don't mind being shared because it looks like these are problem people in the United States, and that the United States would be a better place if you didn't have all these problem Black people. So immigrant communities, I would think, would look and say, okay, association with these people that are always projected so negatively and with negative interactions that they may have had or they may have heard others having, you know, cause them to say, well, why should you be affiliated with these particular people if they don't tend to be on an upswing? And plus, staying away from them, you know, might be better. It's not going to get you any brownie points, so to speak, to be affiliated with them. And I think that is a perception that's rampant, you know, in the country. And because of that, then people can make all kinds of, you know, assertions about, well, you know, African American people don't work hard, or their views and values, you know, keep them in doldrums, you know, and negative behavior and a negative level of achievement.
Okay.
Where I think that there are lots of high achievers, but we do have. They're not highlighted, but there are negative problems in the community. And I love our people. I love the rest of the African family, but the so-called native Black people in the United States are the direct people that I come from. So I want to state that up front, that when I make a critique, it's because I know that we can be a better people, as we have been, even under difficult circumstances, and we can do better. We just got off track in certain ways. Okay, and if we can make a concerted effort to concentrate on self-critique, self-repair, as opposed to almost a majority emphasis on material to gain empowerment. In other words, you might need some monies in this society for empowerment, but self-repair, views, values, and other things that create a better quality person, ideas, and mind will help to make a better community that will be able to optimize whatever physical resources and positioning of resources that we already have.
Okay.
That's one of the things that I think is lacking. Now, I'm not sure whether or not that's something that if you wanted to talk about in another.
No, we can talk about that because definitely.
I mean, we can do it in another show.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe that
the projection. I didn't want to go all the way off track, but I do want to talk about, because like I said, I've had one of these books on my list. It's called The Negro Dilemma. I'm not sure, where in the early 1900s is the conversation of what shall we do with them, right? And so when you're looking at what's happening or the projection on the media, it's it's a psychological, slandering, if you say, of the person of this people group who for a long time, for instance, when you look back over some of these slave codes, if you were freed while there was still slavery and people didn't want you, the powers that be didn't want you to corrupt the people group, they would send you off. They would say, listen, in 10 days, you got to leave the county, or don't let me see you in Virginia, or you understand what I'm saying? Or send them to another island, or send them far, far away. And we still have that thought process, such as the prison industrial complex, like get them out of my sight. But the thing is, this has always been the case. So if one is studying history and saying this has always been the case, then at what point and I know the injury that happened in the trauma bond, at what point do the people say, you didn't bring me or want me here outside of the capacity in which you brought me here? You understand what I'm saying? So the more you try to force, it's like an abusive relationship. The more you try to force yourself in that person's sight, is the more extreme their measures get to remove you from their sight. This is why I find this new conversation very interesting, because historically, it's like, okay, I'm giving you a chance to get out my face, but if you don't get out my face, then, you know what I'm saying? It's about to be on and popping, basically. Okay. And that's kind of what, this is kind of what, when you talk about what's on television and what's being done, it's to a certain degree, I'm going to now equip you, and I'm going to create an environment where you're going to be willing to do it yourself. And I can stand off and be like, wow, look at what they're doing. They're just crazy. You see what I'm saying? And so if we look at along the way, all of the things that have been done and have been allowed to do, and ultimately, like what you're talking about, the gangster rap narrative, you could ultimately say, I'm just trying to stop them from hurting themselves. But the environment that was created, the reason that you need it, and I have to, like, he's heavy on my heart for some reason, but the reason why the people, to my estimation, are looking at someone such as the brother who just died in California is somebody who went against the odds of the system that they didn't create. You see what I'm saying? So now you're getting street cred just for starting at zero to getting out of this trap that you didn't necessarily create, which is another conversation. I know it is, but so it's you can't talk about one thing without talking about the other, because then it's not really giving an accurate depiction of what's really happening and why certain things are significant, and what do you do after you hear all of this. But I guess I'll play another part, and then we could. What time is it? Ooh, time is gone. Okay, I'll play another part.
Having babies. They just have babies out of wedlock. For what? What are they doing this? What are they having babies for? Babies are tight.
Okay, babies out of wedlock. So in just 1 minute, she named a lot of heavy hitters. I think I spoke about it before. The Monahan report tried to do the very same thing and paint this image of marriage not being something that is upheld in the Black community, and therefore you have generations of children who are just baby daddies and baby mamas. What are your thoughts? Is that accurate? Is it inaccurate? What are the marriage statistics amongst melanated people? And is this part of why many people are not getting the respect that they could be getting from outside?
Too many babies out of wedlock. Now it's about, some statistics list about 75% of Black children being born out of wedlock. Where in the 1960s, maybe about 20%.
I have those statistics. Maybe we come back and talk about those statistics, but go
ahead. We're talking about the inability to care for children. We're talking about, not having necessarily a stable home. We're talking about not seeing a man in the home in this particular situation. We're talking about a diminished role of a man in the community and in the home. We're talking about a whole lot of things that's gone wrong. See, like one of the things I think that went wrong too was the integration ideas of the 1960s. So much of an emphasis on that as opposed to African people at the time looking at integrating within ourselves, across between, male and female integrating within ourselves, trying to find a way to use each other as a resource to build community, to, heal wounds that had been created from, in the United States, slavery, Jim Crow, to create a positive image as African people to each other. We worry more about integration with Caucasians than integrating within ourselves. And I think some of these ideas, some of these concepts cause more of a split that begin to translate into broken homes and things like that.
I would agree with what you just said, because it's a trickle. Again, many people who are looking on the outside may not care enough to, or take the time to analyze all of the dominoes that had to fall to get to this point. But economics is a big one. I think as I was doing the research about the 50s and the 60s, when there was this big push from the southern farms to the northern spaces, Chicago, New York, there were a lot of men that were migrating to go get jobs and things of this nature. You know what I'm saying? And then you had a lot of women. So a lot of these places, when they went and took these polls and did these numbers, there was a whole economic or cultural thing that was happening that may be reported, but not so that you can get the full idea why you may have this quote matriarchal takeover, where these women were having to come together and rear children because the men were going off, and some came back and some didn't come back. You know what I mean? And some went off and started new families. And so you have this broken dynamic, like you said, this inability to heal the initial injury from slavery, and it just kept dominoing up until this point in time. So I'm gonna press another one of her.
Okay, so to sum it up, there are a couple of reasons my Nigerian parents don't like Black people. So the first one, my parents think all Black people are disrespectful. And when you're saying every single person acts a certain way, most of the time it's not the case. Because I know a couple of my friends who are Black and they're not disrespectful. I mean, they acknowledge what their mom and dad have given them. They say, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. It's just the way that media has portrayed them to be disrespectful and loud and rude to one another.
So she touches on the media component as well of this disrespectful. Like I said, this is what entertainment has to do with it. Reality TV is relatively new, but these scripted roles are coming from decades ago. And so she's also citing media as a contributing factor to the perception that other peoples have of melanated people here. And you made that point as well. Did you have anything else to say, to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's the major end of it, in terms of the negative perceptions. It's the notion that what is now the so-called rap culture is the culture of the African American person, when really, and perhaps another venue could get heavily into the African tapestry and texture of the United States in general, that many of the practices of the African American people are actually very African. They just don't know sometimes that they are, but a lot of things are documented, and the contributions in an African sense sometimes go unacknowledged. Let me put it that way. So by the African American community, I think in certain ways, as overall folk, not knowing their Africanness or it being assumed that they don't have, you know, a diaspora African culture, and that narrative sinks in, then the notion that African American people are just black as in a racial abstract, but empty of culture, empty of an African culture, has in some way falsely led even some newcomers to this space to believe that, well, everything has been removed from these people, a blank slate, and what has been put in its place is something that's tainted, uncouth, and that's their culture. Rap is their culture, and whatever negatives are associated with that are broad brush for the entire culture. So if you notice in the very beginnings of the audio that you played, the young lady in recalling the sentiments of her mother said, why do Nigerians hate black people? Aren't either Nigerians black, or aren't we all black? So the idea that someone is thinking of themselves as Nigerian, and that is to connotate a country, languages, obviously a geographical space separately from another, and all sorts of ideas about culture, 7 major areas of culture, everything from mythology and folk tales to dress to language to technology to ideas about, you know, political construction, economic construction, organization, all those kind of things is encased within the idea of calling someone a Nigerian. But then when reference to a black person, then black then becomes, well, yes, you're talking about a marker about skin tone, but what else is there? Is there anything about dress? Is there anything about language? Is there anything about particular foods? Kind of like you have an empty vessel. And so I think this kind of idea is presented so that when people look at the African American person, they see black, but they see an emptiness of culture. And I think that on the African and remiss to not emphasize our Africanness and not have researched it fully so that becomes part of the narrative when interfacing with immigrating black peoples from African countries and Caribbean countries. Because again, as I wanted to say, the first and second generation or new immigrants from these spaces are about 10% of the overall African diaspora in the United States. So if that's the case, it would be, to me, up to the majority of the African diaspora, which people might call, for lack of a better word, African American community, to basically set tone and set the way in which a conduit is created for how to interface these newcomer Black people, African and Caribbean peoples into the United States. I think that Black organizations should have forecasted how to do that. Historically, Black colleges should have been major vehicles to help to do that, to basically, if you will, resettle and to present a certain kind of narrative of inclusion and immersion, so to speak, of newly arriving immigrant people. It's not that they wouldn't maintain who they were before coming. It's just the narrative about the inclusion and the interface upon coming. And I know that perhaps in another show we can deal with how and why Europeans dealt with that, or Caucasians dealt with that. You know, to transfer the U.S. from a British space to a pan-European space to a pan-Caucasian space, all with the notion that these different Caucasian peoples over time who were coming to this formulated United States would have to be melded in so that you wouldn't have all these different Caucasian people at each other's throats.
But isn't it true that there was some turbulence, that wasn't necessarily a smooth transition? Like you had Italians who at one point wasn't necessarily accepted as such, and you had, you know, even at certain points in history, the Irish wasn't accepted. They were, you know what I'm saying? So they even had a transitionary period where there was a lot of turbulence. And if I'm not mistaken, it's like 1900s before even, you know, or you're coming from these spaces. If you're not from England or you're not from, you know what I mean?
That's why I said a transition. And I know I wrote down some notes for another show to deal with that. But that's why I'm saying we have to deal with how the United States became what it is and the transitions that parallel why or what were the reasons that it didn't happen about African people being able to integrate with one another. But as I said, transitioning from a rogue British stocked colony to a European colony to a pan-Caucasian colony. These are all differences to create additional inclusion. You see? So in other words, when we talk about the integration of Italian people in, then we're talking about the transition to a more pan-European situation, of which the original stock of the white people mostly were British stock. We say British, we're talking about, you know, Welsh, Irish, English, and Scottish. Then they had to hammer out what it would mean for them to meld together, and then to deal with the integration of these other groups. So when we start talking about Italian people, we're talking about the acceptance of Catholicism as opposed to British Protestantism. That's one of the reasons why Italians weren't accepted, not just because they were of a different stock, but because of their connection to the Catholic Church, as in being Catholic. So
very interesting.
See, these are all expansions. So now when I say finally becoming a pan-Caucasian colony, then that means that numbers of people in the United States who are now regarded as white/Caucasian are not necessarily European. So in the US, as you know, anybody that's you know, of an Arab background, regardless of the strain, is regarded as Caucasian. Anybody who's Hispanic is on paper Caucasian and waiting in the queue to assert that. The only people that basically are not Caucasian in any stretch of the imagination are people who are not Bantu. We can deal with that term later, but I'm using Bantu to talk about you know, Black people unmistakably from the African continent, language, geography, cultural history, etc. So
I guess as we wind down here, because the baby just ran up on me, but as we wind down, I would definitely want to thank you for coming through. I want to thank everybody who's tuned in. We're having the discussion with Brother Baruti. A very good discussion. A lot of points were brought out. Y'all know I like to sum stuff up and, sometimes get a little joke here and there. So would it be fair to say, right, based on what I'm hearing, that the possible perception is that the new Black, Caribbean, or African immigrant is the new house Negro? And the melanated people here have become the field Negro? Proverbially, of course. Is that a fair assertion? Is that how, because this animosity that I'm hearing, like I said, what do? I read a lot of narratives and I read a lot of history. This contention existed in-house because the perception is you're a little bit closer to the table, and this is why you have access to the crumbs. And so is this a field Negro, house Negro conversation?
I don't know. I mean, I guess you could try to make that metaphor. I mean, we
gotta paint the picture. We gotta paint the picture because this is when you hear stuff like crumbs, the table, you get in favor. All that's saying is
that's true.
Close the door. Hold on. Go ahead. I'm coming. All that's saying is that in a system of oppression, you're getting a little bit more of you're getting a little bit more perks that I used to get or used to have access to. And that's kind of the lens from which, when I'm summing it all up, I guess, in the way in what's heavy on my mind right now, is that's what it sounds like.
But what I'm saying to you is that someone can try to make that narrative. I know the narrative you're talking about, or try to make that metaphor like that. But I'm saying to you that the so-called African American person community could be doing a lot better than we are with a change of views, values, and cultural habits, despite racism. So I'm saying that I don't believe that the immigrant Black communities, plural, is the problem that is keeping the African American community from progressing, even if white people do favor, for varying reasons, the African and Caribbean immigrants. In fact, the African and Caribbean immigrant populations are not large enough to displace the so-called native Black communities in general. In fact, there are lots of, intermarriage and integration already with these different groups already. You see what I'm saying? So if somebody were talking about reparations, we need to talk about eventually why reparations is seen by some as such a competition. In other words, if one group gets something, the fear that the other group is going to get something, rather than everybody being able, regardless of the circumstances, being able to access everything. Because we aren't talking about just money. See, the ADOS, they're talking about they're talking about an economic package of access to not just a check payout, but all sorts of other benefits as part of an economic package designed to eradicate what they say is the wealth gap between whites and Blacks in the country. So if we were to take, on average, overall, whites have about 10 times the level on average of wealth of Black people in the US. Okay, that's true. And the ADOS has made arguments that the presence of African and Caribbean immigrants either skew the data or that their presence make it appear as though Black people are doing better than they actually are, because whites would like to use the data of the so-called Black immigrant to make it appear as though things are more fair and equitable in the United States from an economic standpoint. And that the ADOS is saying, well, if you move the statistics of the African and Caribbean immigrant out of the way, you'll really see the actual socio-demographic data and socioeconomic levels of the majority, 90% of the Black people in the country. So that's why they keep trying to harp on the notion, in part, about the avatar, that the African and Caribbean immigrant masks the low socioeconomic production of the overall Black community, and the perception that these people are coming to take advantage of things that the so-called African American community had fought for in gains. And I'm saying that white people do favor African and Caribbean immigrants, but the African American community could be doing a lot better if we change the views, values, and some cultural habits, even spending habits.
I was just going to ask you
as
we go. I was just going to ask you for one practical way in which it may not, instead of, like you said, some introspection and just looking within, one practical way in which no other group, where you can't project whatever this is on no other group. So you're going to go with spending habits, and I was going to ask you for that. So go ahead. What are some ways that the melanated community here on mainland continent can look at some of the things that they're doing to kind of do some in-house clean? You were just going to go into
probably. Well, one is, emphasis on reading, emphasis on education, being a good student in school, views and values about building community, ideas about how you speak and project yourself, following authority, direction. I'm saying these things don't all sound like money, but they do regiment you into a certain idea about projection that gets into ethics, gets into interaction with other people in your community, so that you're also the idea about conflict management. See, like conflict management, in general.
That's a big one.
Yeah, I'll give you one example just to show you about projection, if I can. A few days ago, I happened to be sitting in a little fast food restaurant. Actually, it was Burger King. And I had some food, and I was writing down a few notes. Actually, it was some notes, going over some notes and thoughts about the upcoming show that we're having today. And all of a sudden, I heard, and this Burger King was on, predominantly African American side of town where I live, actually. And all of a sudden, I heard a sort of a commotion a little bit. I was wondering what the fuss was about. And this Black man, maybe he was, I don't know, maybe approaching 40, maybe, got up and said, "Can you believe that this guy behind me is checking out what I'm wearing?" Now, it turns out there was an older gentleman who critiqued the younger guy, the one that's approaching 40 maybe, about the fact that the guy had sagging pants.
I knew he was going to go to the sagging pants.
Yeah, and can you believe that the younger guy, got up and amongst the patrons in the space said, why is it that this man is worried about what I'm wearing? He's criticizing me for having saggy pants. He said, but I want to say what he's saying. He said, what kind of man looks at another man's, and he said the word ass. He said, what kind of man does that? So actually, when the guy said that publicly, I actually said, sir, that's not why this elderly gentleman in our community, the elder, is critiquing you because he's trying to be immoral. He's critiquing you because of the way that you are appearing, because he finds it offensive and indecent that you would have
You're exposing
your posterior exposed like that. And I said, he is trying to make a corrective because he does not want to see black men projected in that way. Okay. Now the guy left, and I went over to the older fellow and I said, sir, I just wanted to say that because I don't think you were wrong for your critique. And I said, I can remember a time in which, if an elder person said something to a younger person, they knew the person was speaking to correct them, and they learned to stand down. Okay. And then we took, we heeded authority more so. In fact, parents in an older day wouldn't even think about kids having their pants down or them looking indecent in that kind of way. So we've certainly made a downskid, right? A downslide, And I wanted to say that, I was thinking about that before we did the show, but I didn't know if it would come up.
It's organic. It's organic. It works.
Yeah, for me to point that out. But that's where we are, and that imagery is broad brushed across the world, across the United States, and a narrative that's projected to others that look at how uncouth these people are. You see? So I know that that's a downskid, has not always been the case. And perhaps in another venue, we can talk about how this began to happen on a more in-depth level, what can be done.
I think you touched on it. When the mother and the father each have roles, the masculine and feminine energy each brings something to the table in rearing of children, the broader community, the grandparents, the village, right? And so when a child sometimes is, in many instances, is left to raise himself because the parent or parents are just defending, keeping their head above water, then that child becomes indifferent and resentment towards correction and redirection. And so when you get older, this thought process is, you can't tell me anything. And as you're saying, I've seen children, if their parents don't teach them to stand down, then they're going to go out and disrespect people in the street. And this is kind of, I've even seen parents in my generation where you can't even correct their child, because before they would say you can correct someone else's child. Now they say nobody corrects my child. I'm the only one who, you see what I'm saying? And so it's like a trickle down effect where that child feels as though even for their own life's sake, they cannot be corrected.
Now, what some older Black people think is that integration of schools in the United States is the problem for all of this. In fact, you'll hear a lot of older Black people say integration was the worst thing that happened.
I've heard that said, yeah.
See, I don't think that it was really just the integration of schools. I think that it was, we did not integrate within ourselves for our own unity, our own cultural understanding, our own healing of damage that had been done from slavery about our own images. Do we like ourselves as African people? Do we like the way we look? Do we like ourselves? Do we think that we can progress? Do we need each other to move ahead, and what kind of impact would that have if we had that kind of strength and unity amongst ourselves? I think we took some wrong turns that led to some of the fallout that we're seeing now. And I'm hoping that, you know, in another show, we can kind of get into that.
Yeah, I think that's the I Ain't No African clip. I'll play that again and really explore, you know, some of the thoughts on why it's, for many people, it's not beneficial. I'm not going to go into it now, but we have to look at the psychology of it. You know what I'm saying? Because there's a whole psychological thing, there's a whole needs thing, there's a whole survival thing that's going on, and a lot of people are still in survival mode. And some of the things that we're looking to, it's like, and I've said this before, if the child in school is hungry, the child is not going to learn sufficiently. If the child in school is emotionally troubled, the child is not going to necessarily reach its fullest potential. And so if we go outside of school and look at the way in which we learn and the things that we've gone after, or the people have gone after, thinking, like you say, the wrong turns, is because at that time, that was the pressing need. You see what I'm saying? Because that was, we go through this door, this is going to get us here. You go through the door, you're like, oh, wow, wrong door. You know what I mean? And but you have a whole nation of people behind you. And after a while, people are like, oh man, nobody want to hear that. You know, I've been hearing that for generations. My grandmother heard that, and we still are in a better situation.
Right.
So, and so the people have kind of like fatigued themselves really and exhausted themselves to where it's like, you know, what now? You know, so definitely I want to thank everybody for joining us. I see a lot going on in the comment section. I usually come to the comment section, but so much has gone on in the comment section. I don't even know.
Can I leave one? I wrote down one idea, and maybe we can talk about this in depthly later or whatnot. But I put down the, unfortunately, repair. And I know we didn't really get into reparations and what this may mean, but repair. Repair is seemingly not discussed in terms of cultural healing, spiritual restoration, and trauma therapy, but instead material acquisitions. And somehow or another, I feel like repair is always talked about in terms of material acquisitions, and we sort of leave dangling or of seeming unimportance about the cultural and healing and trauma therapy.
Definitely. I think that's a full body conversation, right? You know, I'm be all up in that conversation because healing and therapy is, you know, and then we have to, you know, look at it from a realistic standpoint. You know what I'm saying? Everybody isn't at, although it may appear to be, everybody isn't at the same starting point. And so this contributes to trying to give a solution for the collective. But we can talk about that. We could talk about that at another time. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This has been an interesting conversation. We've gotten a little headway. You know, we've gotten some something to think about, some nuggets, right? So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I'm definitely going to have other videos. You know, I speak about spirituality, history, things of this nature. I just kind of got sucked into this space right here and kind of been fleshing it out and unpacking it. So again, if you want to come on the other side of the screen and you want to have the discussion respectfully in a kind of panel setting, I see everybody's a little bit talkative tonight. So feel free to let me know. Hit me up. The email is down below and we can make it happen. Where we can come and have a broader discussion about this topic and other topics as well. So thank everybody for tuning in. Yeah, let's keep it clean and professional, brothers and sisters. Yeah, on the channel, no curse words, no cursing each other out on the channel, because one of the ways in which to repair our relationship is respect. Right? So
what kind of comments are you getting? I mean, in general, what's the gist of a few of the comments that you're getting?
Brother Baruti, don't let me go down the rabbit hole.
Well, no,
comments today was all over the place.
I can't see what you're seeing, so give me
because I have it up on just the YouTube
Okay.
So we just have talking about Crumb Snatchers. We addressed that. Why do African Americans kill each other is a question. We talked a little bit about that. And we talked about the African participation in the slave trade.
That's something we should do too. That would be a good one.
Yeah, that's another discussion, because again, that's a sensitive topic. Like, I started to look into that. There's some truths that we have to come to grips with that. And then let me see here. The question about basically, what are you kidnapping Africans? We need more history. We need to be able to flesh a lot of this stuff out, and people, places, times, tribes, participation, all of this stuff, because African is a very blanket statement.
Right.
And then it's kind of along that line. Then we had some people interacting with each other, which is good.
Okay.
We had some people interacting with each other. We have Tertia, shout out to you, but we need to learn how to survive if the system crashes. When I was speaking about hard skills, what she's trying to say is our forefathers had the skills to survive off the land. And that's what I wanted to talk about. I'll leave you guys with this. I guess I'll put it on the information board. Why that was inside of my mind is when I shared that before, the Trinidadians who were Black loyalists who fought in the war of, I believe, 1812 and was promised their freedom from Britain, and Britain or England put them in the English colony, which was Trinidad. And I'm gonna share the documentary. It's short, but they used their descendants to actually film this documentary, which I thought was cool. But what happened was, where they put them on the island, because slavery was still the order of the day, they didn't want them to corrupt the slaves. And so they put them in this bush, like the southern end of the island, where there was nothing. And because they had hard skills from where they were coming from, they were able to make to carve out for themselves this colony and this community that the descendants are still there to this day. And so when I talk about those skills that were translated into real, whether or not you're going to survive or not, I thought that's very important, and it's still in the forefront of my mind, and that's kind of why I brought that up. But I'll share that documentary link on the comment board. If you're not checking out the comment board, check out the comment board. We see Toussaint in Haiti. Oh, we're talking about, okay, they're talking about, see, when people talk about culture, this is another one about spirituality, and somebody's talking about Toussaint Overture, practicing voodoo and defeated the greatest. So we're going to have to talk about that. We're going to have to talk about all that stuff. There's a lot of stuff here. So when you watch the replay, yeah, I'm not touching it right now, y'all. I'm 2 hours in. I saw 1 hour and 30 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and say, everybody have a blessed day. Continue to be safe, all praise be to the Creator. Hopefully we'll see you again. Continue to learn, continue to grow, and teach the children, y'all. Teach the children. All right? One.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming.